So our last speaker, Shane Forney with Sentinel Fertigation. I think he'll be a good wrap up to all the topics we've talked about today, and really interesting. So
I'm Shane Forney. So you're going to see a lot of the same slides, but I'm with Sentinel Fertigation. Little background on our company. Sentinel Fertigation was founded by Jackson Stanzel after his master's research. As kind of mentioned, this all started with Project Sense, which then turned into, or also included, fertigation scheduling with drones. And then when Jackson graduated, he thought the results that he'd gotten were pretty positive and not worth letting the platform that he'd created die with the research grant. So that is how Sentinel Fertigation started in 2021. Fast forward to now, we've been a commercial company for a couple years, and so I'll kind of go through what we do and some of the results we've got, and then after that I'll kind of dive into a little bit of the agronomics of it. So Sentinel Fertigation is the company. In Time is the name of our platform. Kind of like Javed said, it's a nod to one of the 4 R's, which is providing nitrogen at the right time. That's really what our application is it's a timing application for timing fertigation events. Now, our In Time platform would have a lot of application in rain-fed acres, especially if like the short corn platform really hits commercial stride, because then we can make those split or those delayed applications of nitrogen throughout the growing season. But the reason that fertigation is kind of our focus right now is because we can make those nitrogen applications later in the season. Now that you know the background, how our platform works. So our In Time platform takes in imagery from 2 different sources at this point in time. Our near daily imagery comes from Planet, and that's 3 meter per pixel. And we're looking at the NDRE vegetative index from that imagery. We also have access to Airbus imagery, which is 30 centimeters per pixel. Also looking at the NDRE vegetative index from that satellite imagery. But that is our high resolution imagery. It obviously costs more because it's high resolution, but with that 30 centimeter per pixel imagery, you can see a wellhead, you can see individual rows, very high quality imagery. We take that imagery, and I'll go into the setup of the field to explain it a little bit more, but in our imagery, we're able to isolate out nitrogen impacts. So imagery for crops is not a new idea. Obviously, there was folks flying airplanes decades and decades ago, taking pictures of crops, looking for issues. But the problem with imagery was there's not an actionable recommendation from that picture. You could see, if you used even like a vegetative index like NDVI, you could see a red area of the field, which red typically means bad, but it wasn't tied to an issue. You had to go out, scout the field, see what the problem was. With our analytics, we're able to isolate out the nitrogen is or is not what's causing that crop to have a poor reflectance value. So our platform then does press out a recommendation to the grower. Right now we do that via text messages. We're revamping our app, so hopefully next year our growers will just get a push notification on their cell phone rather than a text message. So I kind of referenced this. In order for our imagery to be able to isolate out that nitrogen stress, what we have to do is we have to have a canary and a reference plot. So this paired plot technique that we have is actually patented to us. So you'll see a lot of other imagery companies that are trying to do nitrogen recommendations. What makes us different is the paired high and low plot next to each other. And what that does is that helps us calculate a sufficiency index. That's how we put an actual value that we can assign to the crop regarding nitrogen, whether it is sufficient or is not sufficient. And then our platform in the background does all the math to calculate those values, so we don't have to worry about it. We just get the recommendation of whether the crop does or does not need more nitrogen. We can apply these blocks in 2 different ways. Either you can see the blocks here, which would be applied with a ground rig, or we can apply them with a center pivot, either by speeding up the pivot or slowing it down to get our high and low nitrogen slices. If someone does have a variable rate fertigation pump, we can write a prescription, although those are not super common because they're so spendy. or like I said, the ground rake. The key here is we really need to have those plots established between V3 and V7, especially this year where the eastern part of the state was in a drought. What we really saw is if we did not have enough plant available nitrogen at the beginning or just before that high nitrogen uptake period, we got behind. And in 2 fields, it was enough that we had a very negative impact on yield and profitability. A lot of times with our platform, we'll be within 3 to 5 bushels yield, maybe a couple bushels less, but our nitrogen savings are so great that it's still more profitable, kind of like what Javed was talking about. We're looking at the economic return rather than just pure bushels per acre. But we have to have these blocks established by V3 or V7. Somewhere in there or before is really when we need to have these blocks established. I call them blocks. There's no physical sensor or anything out in the field. They're just areas of the field with more and less fertilizer. Once those plots are set up in the field, this is kind of how the process of the platform works for the grower. They get imagery with the planted imagery. It's near daily. And then within 24 hours, we analyze that image and push a recommendation to the grower. We build in a little bit of time. Probably takes a few days to get a tank out by the field, out to the wellhead, get the fertigation pump set up, run that application. We actually lock the platform out. So after we push a recommendation to apply more fertilizer, you won't get another recommendation for at least a week after that application, because we want to give that fertilizer time to get into the soil and then the plant to start taking it up. So we're not giving you a recommendation and then 2 days later another recommendation. But other than the week-long lockout after an application, very rapid progression from imagery to recommendation, which is obviously different from tissue samples, or as we've seen in potatoes, petiole samples, where you take a sample, it goes to the lab, it takes maybe a week to get your results back. And if you're behind, a week later, you're really behind. This is what our dashboard currently looks like. We're revamping it this year, so it would look different for anyone that would sign up for this for next year. But a grower can log in, or their crop consultant, and get a recommendation for the field. Do not apply nitrogen. That means the field is sufficient. For folks that really want to dive into the data, we provide the sufficiency index, which is our calculated value from the NDRE and also the NDRE value. And the grower or crop consultant can expand that out and actually look at all the different values and find different areas in the field that might have a lower sufficiency index. One thing I do want to point out that's very different in imagery, because a lot of folks just assume NDVI. I think NDVI was so ubiquitous for a while that for us, NDRE is way more sensitive for nitrogen stress. So it was really apparent this year, and with the projector it may be hard to see, but you can almost see these pie slices are from a UNL low nitrogen study from the year before, showing up on a field that we were on this year for one of our on-farm trials. So that it was just really cool to see how sensitive that NDRE imagery is to nitrogen. So why we think this is important, obviously we're all here because nitrogen is such an issue. We think that there's a lot of different ways people try to manage their nitrogen, and whether that's looking if the crop turns yellow, that's a method we've talked about, is want to make sure we don't turn the crop yellow. All the universities have different recommendations, which are very good, especially if you take into your credits properly. I would say that's probably, from my opinion, the biggest challenge with a UNL recommendation or a K-State recommendation would be making sure those credits are taken into account and not just left out. And then plant tissue analysis. These all kind of have their challenges. We feel like our platform addressed some of these challenges in that we provide you a daily recommendation. We are calibrated to nitrogen stress. And then rather than a model and predicting what the crop needs, we're actually using the crop as our sensor. So some of the results that are why we think that using the crop as a sensor as opposed to just predicting is, and my font's got a little messed up. My apologies for that. But in research, Jackson's research, what he found is that he was able to save about 43 pounds on average of nitrogen across the fields he was on in 2022, which at the price that nitrogen was then, that was about $22 per acre. Excuse me, that was prior to 22. 2022 was our first commercial year, and the results commercially were almost the exact same as what he'd found in research, and that we were able to save about 40 pounds of nitrogen, improve the nitrogen use efficiency on those fields by about 23%, but with the high price of nitrogen in 22, those per acre savings were $40 per acre. In 2022, we were efficient on nitrogen to produce a bushel of grain on every field except for one that we had yield data for. So we had a very good win percentage on efficiency. But we also wanted to look at profitability. We did have some issues. We had a field hailed out and a couple fields that lost their irrigation. On those fields, we were not more profitable than historical averages, but other than that, we only lost on about 3 fields. So we found that across these fields, we can pretty confidently say, we can save you money. You might not produce your highest yield. We think you can produce the same yield on less nitrogen. From 2022 to 2023, we grew from about 8,000 acres to 18,000 acres, and from 3 service providers to 22 service providers. So we're getting really good adoption, not just in Nebraska, but growing outside of Nebraska. We grew down to the panhandle of Texas. We've got a service provider in Illinois that's really growing this past year. We had trials in Tennessee and some fields down in Alabama. So got some really good adoption. We feel like we're really honing in on just helping broad acres grow the same amount of corn on a lot less nitrogen, obviously is the key thing we want to do. For this year, these are up till about right before Christmas. We've still got a few more fields. Commercially, our average nitrogen use efficiency is about 0.7. Our nitrogen savings is about the same. We're saving farmers about 40 pounds of nitrogen over what their typical reported practice would be, which, as we calculated, kind of depending on what the price of nitrogen you use, is about $25 an acre. And so our profitability is pretty substantial. We also did have the on-farm research trials, which I think there'll be probably something a little more formal, but there were some where we were just going against just the farmer's historical practice, and other fields in which Adapt-In was also on those fields. And in a lot of cases, our nitrogen use was lower and our profitability higher. Our bushels per acre, we don't have that up there, was, I think on these it was about 3.5 bushels average lower, but not statistically different when you're looking at 250 bushel yields. So we put together a couple use cases because we found that I think that the management practices really affect the value proposition for our platform for different farmers. For example, near Chapman, we've got some folks that we call these folks spoon feeders. They apply a light base rate up front, and then throughout the year, many 20-pound applications through the pivot. It works pretty well with their light textured soils, and they wanted to really improve that. So here's a couple fields. Like I mentioned before, we have to have those indicator blocks laid out in the plots, laid out in the field for our imagery to be calibrated to the nitrogen. And this is a busy slide, but hang with me. So this column is a typical practice for these fields without our in-time platform. They've got a little bit of nitrogen pre-plant. When they plant, they put on about just short of 70 pounds of nitrogen. And then from V4, V5 through the reproductive growth stages, a lot of small applications. With in time, that's these 3 fields right here, same fertilizer program up until we try to do these are the establishment prescriptions. So you'll see a little bit higher rates because I guess for these 2 fields we had to get those blocks out there and it was getting a little bit later. So they kind of went with a little bit higher than their typical 20 or 30 pounds. But then the big difference is right here. We did not trigger for nitrogen until tassel on all 3 of their fields. And then down here, you'll see the total nitrogen total. So typically about 250 pounds of nitrogen. We were under 200 on all 3 of those fields, and the yield is right here. Still very good yield for how little nitrogen we were putting on. So we were saving between 50 and 80 pounds of nitrogen. That puts our NUE around that 0.7, 0.75 range, which is where we'd really like to be, and anywhere from $30 to $50 per acre in nitrogen savings. Biologicals have also been kind of I'll say a hot topic lately. This particular operation was going to use a biological that claims a certain number of nitrogen can be pulled out of your program. What these guys wanted to know is, if we pull that number of nitrogen out, are we leaving ourselves short, or does the biological give us that? And when is that nitrogen equivalent to that 40 pounds they say you can pull out available? Is it available right away? Does it take some time? So luckily for us, this operation used our platform to monitor those biologicals. Here's the field layouts. These were, I think, a strip till application to put in the blocks. And again, you'll see without in time, that's their typical practice. So on fields in which they were following corn on corn, they would put a 210 pounds of nitrogen on at V5. On these other fields, they would put 120 pounds up front and then 3 fertigation passes. Both fields, when we were monitoring them, also had the biological applied. And what we were able to do is save them 30 to 90 pounds of nitrogen, depending on the field. And their yields were still 260 to 280, among the best yields that these guys had. This operation actually did have one of the family members win the low nitrogen limited competition this year. So we're really excited to put out 2023's data with this operation. But these guys are growing some really phenomenal corn on, at times, 120 pounds of nitrogen. And the key part of this is, the big difference here is we're letting the plant tell us when it needs more or less nitrogen. So there are times where we will use way less nitrogen. There's times where our nitrogen will be about what the management practice is, but we're just letting the plant tell us whether that's the limiting factor or not. Another case where this is really important, reduce risk. This field near McCool Junction was hailed out in June. What do you do with your nitrogen plan when you're hailed out? You probably don't have the same yield potential as you did before you were getting hailed out. So I don't know, maybe 75%, 60%, how much nitrogen do you need? So what we did is we split the field up into 3 sectors, and they still had their 100-pound pre-plant anhydrous ammonia application. And then the typical plan was to put 3 30-pound passes on through the pivot. Well, what was interesting here is not all 3 sectors of the field acted the same. 2 of the sectors triggered, which then we fertigated pretty late in the season too, R2, and sector number 2 never did end up triggering for nitrogen. So it just showed us that not only year to year are our recommendations different, but we can really start to get site specific if we can break the field up into sectors and make recommendations within the field based on the different parts of the field that may or may not need more nitrogen. Ooh, that was an ugly one. So why it matters, a lot of these you'll see are the same, but it's an important issue. There are 1.2 million chemigated acres of corn in Nebraska. I'm going to just assume that a lot of chemigating meaning any chemical put through the pivot, a lot of that is fertigated. If you're putting something through the pivot, I would guess a large portion of that is fertilizer. In the US, the key number to look at here, from 2018, 2.8 million fertigated acres of corn. That's a lot. That is a lot of ground that is being fertigated or fertilizer put on through the pivot in just corn. Then you look at some of these other crops, corn for silage, sweet corn, cotton, hundreds of thousands of acres that are being fertigated. Kind of beating a dead horse here, I apologize for that, but the issue is big. We saw this map already, but what is important about it is if you look at each one of these black dots is a well. So it obviously correlates, for one reason or another, to irrigation. We need to make sure we're being good stewards with our nitrogen. We kind of saw this, so I'm going to fly through these because I don't want to beat a dead horse too much today, but it is very important if we're going to put on nitrogen onto a field, especially if it's an irrigated field, that we understand how complex the nitrogen cycle is. And the key issue that we are trying to address here is not having too much nitrogen in which a large rain event or your irrigation water is pushing it through the soil profile before the corn needs more nitrogen to uptake it, and that gets into our groundwater. We saw a similar graph to this. If you put all your nitrogen on up front, your risk of leaching is at its highest at the beginning of the season. Because that corn, as we talked about already, the high nitrogen period starts around V9. So that fertilizer may just be sitting out in the field for a month and a half with no need to the crop. And so we say that the field is a poor storage location for your nitrogen fertilizer. We really like to split apply that, especially if there's large rain events, springtime, typically when we get our large rain events. So we're taking that information, like I said, going back to Jackson, starting this with research, thought it was a great idea. We've taken it commercially. Now what we're trying to do is grow with farmers, with all these different organizations. We're trying to work with NRDs, trying to work with UNL Extension, on-farm research. We just completed the 16 precision nitrogen management trials with the on-farm research program. We are also doing trials through the Ag Launch Accelerator in corn and cotton in Tennessee. So that's starting to help our growth outside of Nebraska. We do have trials in rain-fed corn acres. We do have cotton trials down in Texas and Alabama, and then also the USDA LTAR site to see what the kind of climate change or the environmental impacts of using a management practice such as Sentinel fertigation has on the field. As I mentioned, it started all in corn, but we've found a use case in a lot of other crops, potatoes being a key one. Like I mentioned, a lot of potato growers take petiole samples. By the time they take a petiole sample, send it to the lab, get a recommendation back, and then apply that fertilizer on, that process could be a week to 10 days, or we can provide a recommendation the day after an image is received. Popcorn, we've got oats, cotton. We did have some soybean trials. Some of the high yield guys are thinking that a little shot of nitrogen might help benefit the plant. I feel like that's a pretty intense agronomic question when you start to talk about, are soybeans lazy? If you give them nitrogen too early on, do they not nodulate? And we're not going to get into that, but we did monitor 2 fields for nitrogen on soybeans and then rye. As we talked about earlier, cover crops do seem to suck up some of that nitrogen, and then when it's available to the crop later in the season, as that terminated cover crop breaks down, is pretty important to some folks, or if they have nitrogen left. As I mentioned, we did have a field this year we really stubbed our toe on. We had a grower that plants green into a rye cover crop, and then his base rate of nitrogen after emergence was 40 pounds. That is not enough plant available nitrogen, and we got behind. So it was a good learning experience, but we learned that does not work. We have to have, especially with a rye cover crop or something like that, we have to have 75 to 100 pounds of plant available nitrogen out there. If someone did want to get started with to use Sentinel's in-time platform, so we have, like I said, now we're up to 24 service providers. So we like to send our growers through a service provider. We want them to work with someone that's got that agronomic knowledge to check the field if there's something going wrong, help make nitrogen recommendations if they're familiar with the fields, the management practices, all of that. So that's why we work as we work through the current crop consultant or scout or whatever service provider the farmer's using. But if we get someone paired up with the farmer, you can create an in-time account. You can add in fields, whether you've got the field boundaries in shapefile format. If you have John Deere Op Center or the Case IH Connect, we can just pull those fields over. We have integrations with those platforms to just pull the fields over. And then we would need to set up the plots that I talked about earlier, either with the pivot or the ground rig. But those are all it takes to get the analytics started once the growing season starts. There are also some cost share programs that are helping to help farmers cost share our technology. So Central Platte NRD is one of the NRDs that has already got a cost share program set up. With the EQIP program, if you apply for the nutrient management, I think it's 590 is the project code. We are eligible for funding through that. And then we also have some early enrollment discounts going on until February 1st, just to try to encourage folks to get their information to us so we can get it loaded into the platform as soon as possible. That's my contact information. If anyone wants, you can just scan this QR code and it'll create a contact, and you guys can email me, text me, or call me if you think of questions after this presentation, but I'd also take any questions that might have sprung up now. Yes?
What does your imagery actually measure? Is it color?
Yeah, so it's measuring the wavelengths of light that are reflected back. So we get visible light, but we also get that red edge is between red and infrared wavelength of light. So it's actually the reflectance, the amplitude, or the amount of that light that's being reflected back of those different wavelengths of light. If we had a whiteboard, I could maybe draw a graph, but you can imagine when you look at a picture, green is reflected back because as we see the plant, it's green. But then you really see a high amount of that red edge and infrared light reflected back in an image.
And that's the indication of the nitrogen deficiency?
So we're taking a calculation of two different wavelengths and subtracting them. That's the vegetative index. And then those high and low nitrogen plots are the way we can compare two different values to create that sufficiency index. So we use the difference in those images between the high and the low nitrogen plot in the field to create a number that tells us what the sufficiency is.
And when you have the low nitrogen plot, is that something before planting you don't apply nitrogen there?
Yeah, so if we like to just cut the rate back 30 pounds from whatever you're putting on the rest of the field. So if you're putting on, like in Javed's study, they put on 190 pounds base rate on some of the fields. You would put on 160 pounds of nitrogen would be our low nitrogen pass, 190 would be the bulk of the field, and then, well, in that case, 240 would be the high nitrogen plot.
And when you apply the fertigation with the nitrogen, does that have to reach the soil to be active, or can it be absorbed through the plant?
Yeah, I really think that it has to get into the soil, but I'm an engineer, not an agronomist, so I would defer that question to someone to get you a better answer on that. I mean, I know there are foliar products that can be applied to the leaves and the plant can take up, but not my expertise.
You mentioned earlier, and I haven't even talked to Jackson about this, but differentiating between sulfur and nitrogen deficiency, have you been able to separate that, or is your protocol that producers think they might have a potential sulfur deficiency, just apply sulfur? So what's your protocol related to sulfur?
Yeah, great question. So right now, commercially, we're just available in nitrogen. We think we have a way to detect sulfur just because as you know, when you throw some nutrients out of balance, other nutrients will show up as either deficient, or you'll start to get some sort of sign in the plant. But at this point in time, if someone thinks they have a sulfur deficiency, again, that's part of the reason we pair up with crop consultants is we would like that person to make the recommendation for the sulfur nutrient, and we don't have anything to provide a recommendation at this time. Hopefully in the future our sulfur we will be able to make sulfur recommendations.
CVA used the tool this year, and
one of the things we saw about the higher nitrogen rate that you're putting in there is if it was a sulfur deficiency, then that higher nitrogen rate is going to show the same yellowing as the standard or the low. So that's a real good indicator that it's something other than nitrogen.
I didn't know if the protocol was to just apply 20 pounds of sulfur on some of these fields so you don't have sulfur deficiency conflicting or catching you off guard, I guess. That's what I was wondering, if there's a preseason sulfur recommendation or what. I didn't know what CVA's doing on that.
The fields we ran on, we did have sulfur in the program. So, yeah.
Just putting fields into the platform this last year, I know that a lot of guys run some ammonium thiosulfate throughout at some point in the year, I think, to address the sulfur deficiency issues.
Yeah, and I would say our experience with the tool was similar to a lot of the research experience. We were able to save 1 nitrogen pass, so 30 pounds of nitrogen typically. Pretty easy to save.
You mentioned you're doing some rain-fed trials. I think that is pretty pertinent to all of us in southeast Nebraska. Can you touch on that a little more?
Yeah, so the basis of what our platform does is still the same in rain-fed as it is irrigated. Kind of the challenges come in when, if you get a recommendation at tassel right now, what would a guy do, And then the other challenge is, okay, so let's say you flew on some nitrogen fertilizer with an airplane. If you don't get rain, again, it doesn't really help. So we feel like we can still sense nitrogen deficiencies in rain-fed corn just as we can in irrigated. The problem is the grower might not get the value that they're paying for if they can't do anything about it. So we do have trials. One of them is a guy in Kansas was paired up with maybe Rantizo or one of the drone companies, and when his field, it was like a smaller field, maybe 60 to 80 acres, when one of the sectors of the field did trigger, he foliar applied a nitrogen product that was a foliar uptake product with a drone. That's a very cool application. We did get to test it, but I wouldn't put it out there as part of our commercial offering. So I would say that's the hitch right now, is that we can still sense nitrogen. We do have a integration with the DSAT model, which some of you folks might be pretty familiar with, which should help us. That's where we're hoping next year, when we get to maybe V4 to V7, we can put in our plots and then run that DSAT model and try to get a similar estimate of how much nitrogen the crop will need for the rest of the year. But again, it's a model, so it's just taking the information it has and making an estimate. And if the weather is vastly different than what's forecasted and happened so far, that prediction could be off a little bit. So we're trying to grow to where it would still be usable for the rain-fed folks, but at this time I would just say that the value might not be there.
Might be a question for you and also the technical service providers, but have you been able just to pick up any irrigation nozzles, pressure regulators, irrigation application issues in season that have helped farmers catch that early?
Yeah, great question. And yes, absolutely. So we've had, you'll see, as you would imagine, just a rainbow pattern in the field where you can see that a pressure regulator or a nozzle or something is not uniformly applying water. And it's been really cool to see, especially with the high resolution imagery. You can really see like where the kind of the overspray from the 2 nozzles next to it have helped a little bit, but then in the middle, and really seeing some cool patterns like that. We actually had another example where someone was using a dry spreader, and we had set up their AB lines for a 90-foot throw. Well, the operator had the machine set up for an 80-foot throw, and you could actually see the lack of overlap and not uniform application. So it's kind of along those same lines, just byproducts of taking imagery of the field that we're able to pick up on.
All right, well, let's thank Shane for that. That's really awesome. Here's your prize. So along the lines of what Shane just talked about, got 1 minute here. So, yep, Jenny Reese, who is part of our organizing committee out in York County, she put out this nitrogen challenge. And the idea is to use a program like Sentinel or any of the Sense programs. So set aside a field, put on a low base rate, 70 to 100 pounds. You should have the handout if you stopped at the circular table. So it's sort of an on-farm research project, and she's just looking for cooperators. And I'll say, if there are any irrigators in Lancaster or anywhere, I'd like to participate too. So you can take a look at that handout. I think Sentinel and all these sensor tools are really cool and really interesting and have a lot of potential. So if anyone is interested in that. A couple more housekeeping things. The fun part has come up. We really would love it if you could fill out your evaluations. I have them here. I'll hand them out in a minute. So we figured out a way to incentivize you to fill out your applications or your evals and give them back. I have a sign-up sheet. If you give me your evaluation at the end, we'll put your name and address down, and we'll put your name in a hat to win one of those coffee cups. Got an extra one, so we thought we'd make it work. For the live stream people, if you fill out your evaluation, it's anonymous. So when you fill it out, submit it, you can just email me. You have my email. You can email me. We'll put your name in the hat, and then we'll ship it to the winner. Also, if you stopped out there, there's some old magnets from Tyler Williams's day. That website on there is still good if you want to go back and look at any of the recordings. We have all the recordings of all the talks on the website. And just a thanks to Aaron Nigren, Nathan Mueller, Jenny Reese for helping me put this together. Thanks to the sponsors and all the speakers. Really appreciate that. Ratika, our new crops educator in the Southwest 4 counties. Let's see. Johnson, Nemaha, Richardson, Pawnee. So us in the Southeast, we're really trying to get together as a group and work a lot together. So even if you're not from that country, go say hi to Ratika. We're trying to build some programs where we all work together in the Southeast region. And since we're out of time, we'll wrap it up. Thanks again for your participation. I'll get you your evaluation forms, and we'll wrap it up there.